digital transformation, a blended workforce, the gig economy, remote working. These are just some of the phrases that have come to the fore in today's post-pandemic world of work. And yet, as we look into the theme of future of work here on day 2 of the Inspired Are You Future Ready conference, one man, one expert, Mr. Jeremy Blain, will tell us how these terminologies and what they represent have long been relevant even before COVID-19 hit us. Jeremy has close to 30 years of experience, proven at all stages of the business life cycle. He helps organizations succeed in today's climate amidst disruption and uncertainty, bringing opportunity to companies, small and large, across the world. He has launched successful businesses himself and turned underperforming ones into excellent ones. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jeremy Blain. Right, so we have for this next session with us Mr. Jeremy Blain. Jeremy has done tremendous work over a vast number of years, covering things like digital transformation, and I believe with a focus on HR, the human capital sector. And you know, with the name of our conference being Inspired Are You Future Ready, some of these topics, given the recent COVID pandemic, make us question or bring up the question, is this really about the future? Things like digital transformation, remote working, blended workforces are actually cropping up more and more in the now. So that's what we'll be covering in today's interview. Right, so Jeremy, as part of introducing yourself, and also I noticed that you have recently come up with a lot of research on the topics of blended workforces, and also remote working, digital transformation. Could you please kind of let us know what you think about how these sectors or these themes are progressing, especially in the recent months and also the upcoming months?
Yeah, but that's a really good question, Nigel. I think one on everybody's mind at the moment. You're right. I've been going on about a lot of this business transformation for many years now. And as we entered into the 2020s, so let's, kind of just a few months ago now, we were already in a period of uncertainty. We'd come off a 10-year global financial crisis. We still had issues and still do have issues with the China-US trade talks. Uncertainty was there. And within our businesses, we also were trying to cope with the so-called digital transformation and human transformations which were happening. And actually, a lot of those things were around adopting digital. And adopting digital and implementing digital, according to Forbes and IBM, was failing over 8 out of 10 times. Mainly because we weren't getting the implementation right. So, and as you so rightly said, one of the missing pieces being not only a business leader but a human capital professional was the fact that the human side was missing. In this era, the human touch is more important than it ever was, as far as I'm concerned, and we were missing a trick with a big trend that was coming, which I know we'll talk about a little bit soon, which is this rise of the blended workforce, the mix of permanent workers, permanent part-time workers, increasingly remote these days, independent workforce, other contractors and stakeholders. That was before COVID-19 hit. And the operational manifestation of COVID-19, let's say particularly as we hit the beginning of March around the world, was that being the biggest catalyst that we had in transformation really since the iPhone in 2007, which is pretty frightening, isn't it, when you look at it that way. And it did expose organizations that weren't ready. It exposed leaders that were procrastinating around transformation, but it also highlighted some fantastic companies that were doing a great job. DBS, the Vodafones, startups like Moobaloo. Lots of things happening out there. But on the flip side of that, with the success stories, often come the failures as well. And it's no accident that Dr. Richard Foster from Yale has come out and said, look, actually from 1920, if we look at the biggest companies in the world, let's say the S&P 500, the failure rate was 67 years. That's the amount of time they would go through their cycle to possible failure. As we ended 2019, that had reduced to 15 years. As we now are this year, a few months after the pandemic, that is now predicted to halve again to potentially 8 years, and we're starting to see that already. So it's not just COVID-19 pandemic which is causing us issues. It's what we had been doing or not doing beforehand, which was crashing up against COVID-19 as well, and now causing panic with some organizations, but fueling an acceleration for others.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I think, one of the things that you highlighted was human capital. And I think in the midst of scrambling to rectify or to come up with solutions for the problems that organizations are facing, the human side of things is sometimes neglected or forgotten. I just like to bring up something quite close to my heart. It's been said that the phrase "jack of all trades and master of none" is now obsolete, and that we now have this new phrase, "jack of many trades and master of some." What are your thoughts on that? Given we have more and more of the younger generation, or even those who have been in corporate for quite a few years, having to constantly reinvent themselves. And also, and as an extension to that, from an organizational point of view, what are organizations doing right or not doing right in terms of adapting to this new type of workforce?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. And again, I would go back to the fact that it isn't as a result of COVID-19 per se. We've had many years now where organizations of all sizes have downsized. We've had an attitude evolve of more from less. So more skilled people taking up either more responsibility or special projects, special roles. And I concur with it that we are becoming jack of all trades in many cases. Now, sometimes when you're experienced, when you've been through different roles in your business, you may have worked cross-functionally, you've experienced management, you've gone into leadership, you've built those skills, and you're more capable to do it. You're more capable to build expertises in different pots and to work forward with it. Now, though, we've got a couple of things which I think is worth having in mind. First of all, we have many of the rest of the organization that we're picking, if you like, our best performers. We're looking at what else they can contribute, and we're empowering them to far greater levels these days than we did potentially in the past. That's the first thing. So this age of empowerment seems to be rapidly accelerating, and particularly after the pandemic. So if we're empowering, we're naturally asking people to not just deliver in their job role, but to contribute beyond it. The second, and you mentioned it before, is this rather informal trend in terms of how it's been treated, of the rise of the blended workforce, of which I did a piece of research this year around it. And that is really this increasing mix or broadening mix of our organization, where we're pulling in talent, not just permanent talent, but independent worker talent, to do a lot of the roles that perhaps aren't being covered anymore, special projects, pick up things that we've never done before in an organization, particularly going through, let's say, digital transformation and so on. So our ways of work have shifted. We still in that more from less. We're in constant change. All of those things that hit our businesses before COVID-19, as I talked about before, are still there, and we've got the pandemic. Some organizations are doing better, some are not, and some are really struggling. So really, what we have is we have a number of different things impacting this, and some changes are needed. And one thing I would say is that from an independent workforce point of view, and from empowering, let's say, our millennial workforce, what we're also doing is we're giving them the opportunity to experiment and fail early and learn from that and move on, and that's a really good sign. One other trend that is happening, which is quite interesting, which may challenge that moving forward, is that the biggest population, according to the research that we did this year, the Blended Workforce Revolution, the biggest population moving to independent work is Generation X. That's people like me who have said, you know what, I've had enough of the corporate world. I can do this better myself. I have these different expertise buckets, so I am a master of all trades rather than a jack of all trades, and I can contribute in all of these different areas. Because of the global pandemic, and because that many organizations may find that they're downsizing further or losing business or having to lay off staff, there's going to be a glut in the workforce. And I do believe it's the jack of all trades people may suffer a little bit with that, whereas the master of all trades may trump that, where that they can contribute more. Who knows?
Right. So you've mentioned master of all trades and how we are getting an increasing diversity, I guess, in terms of our workforce, given that there are more independent operators out there, if you will, independent workers. Um, what do you think are some of the potential pitfalls in terms of how organizational policies, things like contracts and salaries, and the attempts to kind of bring in these independent workers in line with organizational values and cultures? How do you think that can be implemented in the best way possible?
Well, that's almost two in one to look at. If we look at the data that came out of our research, then what is clear, particularly with the rise of a more blended workforce, and that rise of the blended workforce, by the way, in the research, we predicted that 40% of any organization's human capital will be made up of independent workers by 2025. That was when we released it in February 2020. 3 months after that, after we went back to the survey set, we asked the same survey set and independent workers themselves, what do you think? Do you think that this will accelerate, or do you think it will be the same? By far, the biggest feedback that we got is that that is likely to accelerate and become the norm by the end of 2022. Because as many organizations are looking to utilize more flexible workforce, they're going to look more in the independent workforce as well, as there may be downsize potentially for some organizations, their permanent workforce. So if we are to look at the independent workforce as a much greater part of our organization, then we've got to get better at managing it. And there's a couple of things really that are very stark when you look at what's happening. From the research, for example, at the moment, really good independent workers are only recognized for outstanding work 4 out of 10 times. 60% of the time, it's just, well, we're paying you to do the job. Now, you wouldn't do that with your permanent employees. And if you want them to become a part of your loyal mix, your loyal workforce mix, then we have to have a different mentality. And that mentality is also around payment terms. That it's 75 to 90 days plus that independent workers are being paid. And that's largely because this has been informalized. Often it's from an independent worker point of view, particularly some of the millennials who have moved into that and haven't experienced business, haven't got the skill sets necessarily to negotiate effectively, because what is getting above that is the fact that they're winning the business and they're happy with that. So that's something that's happening. But equally and ethically, organizations aren't picking that up and saying we should be doing something different about that. So for me, what is needed are something that doesn't exist at the moment, which is a brand new manifesto for change in terms of human capital management. And in the research that I did with Dr. Rochelle Haynes, who's a lecturer in the UK and an expert on the gig economy and so on, we found we had to create something, but because nothing exists in terms of human capital management, HR, that actually blends together the management of a permanent workforce and an integrated independent workforce. And we call it gig HR, unsurprisingly, I suppose. And what we find is there are four key things that are missing, which need to be established. And that's the rules, tools, skills, and thrills, as we call it. The rules of the road, built on a very solid foundation of the new values and behaviors that we need to adopt so that our culture is more appropriate, A, for our times, a more digital era, but also for our human capital mix. The tools and the toolkits that we need to enable that with technology. Everybody needs to be skilled up on the same page, because another thing that came out of our research was that there is a huge gap between the so-called digital nomads who are working largely digitally and a lot of traditional human capital leaders and human resource leaders who are still working in more traditional ways, not fully adopted digital yet, not fully transformed into the so-called HR 4.0 era. And I don't just mean actually human capital leaders, to be fair, it's business leaders as well. So this ecosystem of tools and toolkits to help that and to bind it all together is what's really needed. Then, of course, it's the skill sets. It's the new skills that are going to be needed. If the independent workforce is growing, like now with the move to remote working, what are our approaches as an organization to better remote management, remote working, productivity, wellness, all of these things that we may not, which we may have in our minds more informally, which need to be formalized. And then the final piece, the thrills piece, as we call it, which is we have to catch people doing it right. We have to excite and motivate in this brave new world. We have to bring our people together, the independent workers with our permanent workers. We have to have this mentality of collaboration. And when we do it right, really celebrate that, reward those behaviors that we see that are attuned with our new culture and values, and move ahead and continually bring our people with us, which means that even in an era of uncertainty, it may help us if we have all of those four things together, the rules, tools, skills, and thrills, develop a new style of loyalty within this new world.
Well, there you have it. Jeremy has succinctly put it as rules, tools, skills, and thrills, I believe. Just to expand upon that with a quick 1 minute response, what would you say to an organizational management team or HR team which provides the statement, well, if I need to go through all the effort and expenditure to develop, to nurture this loyalty, the values in line with existing company culture and so on, why would I not hire them as permanent employees then?
Yeah, well, this is the changing business models. This is all about whole business transformation, adopting digital to help us do things differently, more efficiently, more effectively, and more remotely. If you're doing things more remotely, there are a couple of things that will happen. First of all, you don't need all of your offices. So there's an immediate cost saving. And in fact, a company like IBM has been doing this for years, since the late 90s. And as they moved away from their offices, their savings over the years grew to $1.9 billion just by moving away. And of their 330,000 odd workforce, 40% right now work remotely. Google is more or less the same. And Google actually then comes back to your specific question. Google is made up of over 55% independent workers who are working remotely, but who can have hot desks in the office. So it's getting that blend right, which means that actually we may be able to do more with less through different workforces. There are special projects that don't need permanent workforce potentially, so we can switch on and off our resources when we can do it and manage it in a more fluid way. So by doing that, it challenges existing, if you like, legacy 20th century cost models and starts to introduce and urge us to develop new 21st century appropriate business models.
Completely agree, Jeremy. And I think, you mentioned the likes of IBM and Google. These are large organizations with a presence worldwide. But I think it's also important for the audience members to realize that even for startup organizations, small organizations, I mean, there's no limit to, who you can work with when it's a remote or a blended workforce. I mean, if you can get talent from halfway across the world that fills the gap required, I mean, what's stopping that from happening? So I think smaller organizations as well have to keep an open mind in terms of these possibilities.
Oh, I think you're right. Just on that point, actually, Nigel, there's a very interesting tweet that I came across a couple of months ago that was just comparing the cost of a remote worker with a permanent worker, whether it was independent or whether it was permanent. And one of the key pieces that came out of there is that, if you are a small, medium organization and you're reliant on the talent around where your head office or main office is based, then you've got sort of maybe 30 to 50 kilometers of talent that you can pool. But if you embrace this more blended workforce, remote ways of working, you've got available to you all of the talent in the planet. That's a heck of a headline.
Okay, Jeremy, you've mentioned a lot about independent workers and people like yourself who you say are already masters of many trades. But let's now look at people who are perhaps just starting off on their career pathways. Um, what do you feel in terms of statements like, independent workers need to have already made it in the corporate world and have vast networks in order to succeed? And also, do you agree with the statement that perhaps the Gen Ys and Gen Zs lack certain skills that are required in terms of functioning effectively as an independent worker? Skills like resilience, skills like empathy, the ability to communicate and network with people.
6 years ago, I came across a guy called Khalid in India who was 21. He was working for an organization who at the time were one of our partners, but he was leaving and he was seeking advice from me saying, I want to do what I do for myself. I don't have all of the business skills, but what I do have this design capability. I've got technology capability where I know that I can benefit organizations that I work with. And I got talking to him because at the time I was working for another organization. I thought, this is exactly the kind of resource that I can use. And I said to him, look, if you're going to do that, I'll give you your first contract. And I, apart from what I was saying before, I certainly look at and always have, when I've had independent workers, looking at them as part of my overall workforce and part of my valued employee network. I said, if you do that, I'll put a retainer in place so that you've got some security to go behind. And we'll work together to do this because I needed our web upgraded. I needed some technology managing and our third-party technology company managing as well. And he did a great job to start with. And from there, he blossomed. And what we did is we supported him through that in developing further skills so that he broadened his skill sets over time. So it was just a different mentality at leadership level in our business to say we should be treating our employees all the same, regardless of whether they're permanent and independent. And if we do, then two things can happen. First of all, they can contribute more. And secondly, there's a great link to loyalty. So fast forward to 2020, and in fact, to the end of 2018, when I set up my organization, my new company, Performance Works, Khalid still works for me to this very day. My most valued member of staff who contributes way beyond what those original skills were, because we've sort of had mutual investment in that. So from a point of view of age or generation or whatever, I do feel there is capability across all generations, whether it's young or whether it's our silver stars, if you like, our baby boomers who are contributing and who can contribute more in our businesses, as they stay longer in our businesses. I think it's just the way we treat them, really. But coming to the second part of your question, there are some skill sets which have emerged, which, let's say, the millennial, particularly the millennial independent workers, may be missing, which explains some of the data I talked about before. For example, stakeholder management skill sets, negotiation, resilience when things get tough. How do they react to those? How can they communicate and have tough conversations? How adaptable are they if they're comfortable with digital and they're dealing with non-digital or more traditional ways of doing? How can they adapt a little bit more? So it's some of the basic things. They were once upon a time called soft skills. I call them power skills. These are the power skills for tomorrow, which are really needed. And those are what need to be formalized, because right now it's informal and down to the individual, and the organization and the independent workers aren't coming together to do it.
Certainly, and a great use of a new term there, power skills. I think if we look at these skills that you have mentioned, mainly a lot of speakers across all the 5 themes of our conference are in some way always going back to these skills. And I think if we also look at the future of work report by the World Economic Forum in 2019, 8 or 9 out of the 10 skills that are expected of workers within the next 5 years are skills that are not in school curriculums, are not in professional development programs. And this is definitely an area that needs to be addressed very promptly.
Agree.
So as we look at remote working and also blended workforces, I mean, these have definitely come to the fore, as you have alluded to earlier, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And as a result of that, I think there's also been a lot of discussion surrounding mental health and well-being. The fact that there are workers who are expected to do meetings or answer emails way beyond usual working hours. The fact that we have workers who are not used to coping with running a family and running their work at the same time within the same room. So how do you see, or what do you think are the measures required by organizations in terms of helping their workforce cope with this? And for independent workers themselves, people like yourself who run your own organization, are there avenues that one could seek?
Well, if I start by going back in time again to the beginning of 2020 and tell you this, that 44% of all global companies, every company in the world, did not allow remote working. That was January 2020.
Oh, okay.
Fast forward a few weeks, or if you'd like to call them months, that's absolutely fine. But a few short months, a few weeks, over 80% of them have had to accelerate that, and some are struggling. Some have suddenly stepped over that great gap through fear and through the need to change, have been forced over there and suddenly realize the possibilities. But with those possibilities come new challenges, and the challenges are really around productivity, around impact on our customers, and around our employees' wellness. Small Business Genius did a piece of research also which talked about 1 out of 5 remote workers being lonely, mainly because they're not supported by the rest of the business. So the business doesn't have any policies, procedures, standards which are more emotionally based, as well as the rational business style ones. But it also said that those companies that are getting it right are enjoying a huge upsurge in productivity, up to 65% more productivity, actually. And when it came down to what really made the difference about remote working, which is working versus not, it's all about the leadership and management of the organization. So it is the management that needs to be repurposed away from performance management into what I would call kind of a more empathetic leadership style. So demonstrating more empathy, making sure that everybody is comfortable first, that we are working in a healthy way, because one of the downsides of working remotely is it's not that you're doing less work, and that's part of the myths and the fears of some managers who are out there. It's that we actually potentially do more. Some have never done it before, are terrified that if they leave their desk, an email will come in or a phone call will come in and they'll get caught. These kind of mentalities are myths, but will perpetuate. So management have to step in and say, we need to find new ways of working. And management themselves then need to be more coaching led so that they can support their organizations to do it. They're supporting not just on the business side, but on the personal side as well. So it's these power skills, Nigel, that we talked about before. These are the things that are going to make a difference. They are no longer soft skills. These are the hard skills of business, which give you great power as an individual and collectively as an organization, a huge boost when you can communicate, collaborate much more collectively as an organization.
And finally, Jeremy, just to briefly conclude on this first half on blended workforces and remote working, many countries are reopening and employers are asking their workers to go back into the office, but I'm sure there are plenty of independent workers and workers who are contracted who will continue to work remotely. So do you have sort of top 3 tips on how to improve their efficacy and efficiency?
Oh, yes. How many can I do? Just 3, is it? Right. Okay. Yeah. So well, first of all, I'll split it into 2. Managers, first of all, have to unlearn and relearn new ways to manage in the remote world. That's for sure. And for me, that centers on a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Fixed mindset, great example, actually, Michael Bloomberg, who was standing for the Democratic nomination for president earlier this year, in 2013 came out and said, this kind of remote working just doesn't work. There's no substitute for the water cooler conversations that we're having. And that will always how it will be. And I sympathize with that. We all need the human touch. This was 2013. In the same year, Richard Branson came out and said, what, in 20, 30 years, we're going to look back and wonder why we ever worked in offices in the first place. This is a growth mindset. And that mindset really helps redefine how the organization really can be shaped or reshaped and can move forward and how it can engage its customers. And the final thing for at management level, I would say, is communicate how to communicate. First of all, learn that yourselves, but then give people guidelines. It is actually a lot of the simple things which make the difference. At individual contributor level, it's being structured. Get your space where you're working right and get your time right on the deep work that you need to do. Things like the Pomodoro technique really work. That's splitting your work. Look it up on Google. Don't have time to go into it now. Then a more refined human skill set, communication skills that work for remote working. For example, very, very quick example, looking into the camera directly, not at where I see your picture, Nigel, down here, where I'm desperately trying not to look there where you're looking and smiling, but into the camera to retain eye contact, because that's what it will do. And finally, then it's owning our own job roles. This could be a new era of empowerment for our people. If we're working remotely, contributing beyond our job role, that really reinforces that collective nature of where we're moving as a business.
Thank you, Jeremy. And these are, as you alluded to earlier, the need for human touch and human skills. And that allows me to tie in very nicely to the second bit of our conversation today. We're looking at transformation of the workplace and workforces within the next 5 years. And the second bit touches on digital transformation and how this phrase, I think, or I believe, I've seen has been abused to a certain extent by a lot of organizations who jump on the bandwagon, perhaps not knowing exactly what it entails. Many people think digital transformation just means getting people onto softwares and using different platforms to automate things that were previously done manually. let me start off with a fairly provocative question. I think the question is digital transformation a myth? And if it isn't, then how can we ensure that the transformation is actually deep rooted, that it will be successful and sustainable?
Is digital transformation a myth? Yes, partly. It is. There is no doubt that technology is impacting our lives. The myth part of it to me is that it's just about technology. It is absolutely not. So when I did a piece of research with another partner, Robin Speculand, in 2019, in the state of digital transformation, we realized that this is the issue where most organizations are failing. I talked about 84% failure rate according to IBM and Forbes earlier. And one of the reasons is that it's around the focus on technology and then the lack of focus on the execution plan that comes from it. Because of course it's all about implementation, and with implementation the big piece missing was the human side to it. So it's not digital transformation. So the terminology digital transformation, I believe, is out of date. It is whole business transformation. And that what is needed is a huge acknowledgement of that. And there is no better time to look at what's happening now, as COVID-19 is this biggest accelerator of digital transformation, as we've talked about, so-called, that by very definition, what we've experienced in the last few months has required not just the technology to be in place, but the human touch to make it all tick, the management to be there, individual contributors to embrace it and learn it, collaboration and communication more virtually. You can't do one without the other.
And once again, Jeremy, this whole idea that digital transformation is just digital. I mean, you have made it very clear that there is a lot of the need to focus on the human element, the human element in this. I referred to the ticking clock model that you have come up with, that your organization is famously known for, and the fact that organizations, you claim, cannot be digitally transformed if everyone continues to work in silos. This is a huge problem. I mean, we see it even in the Sustainable Development Goals in SDG 17, the need for collaboration and partnerships. How do organizations overcome this, given the fact that digital transformation itself sometimes results in us working as individuals and having a very boxed in mindset?
It's a really good question. And in fact, silos work vertically and horizontally. There are functional silos that might have their own systems, own ways of working. And that's where some tensions exist in businesses with a lot of legacy behind that. Horizontally, levels as well. In the survey that we did, over 3 continents around the state of digital transformation, over 40% of leaders were not ready for transforming their organizations. And of those, over half were not willing. We're not willing to learn. We're saying, mañana, we'll do it tomorrow. We'll do it tomorrow. Right now, we have to focus on our numbers. Don't you know, we've just come from a global financial crisis. But transformation doesn't stop and evolution doesn't stop. So that's where we went into the market after this survey and said, well, what models are they using for this? And we couldn't find any. There was no implementation model for the so-called digital transformation. There was about technology implementation, and that's where we started to realize that they were missing a big trick, this human component, and that's where the ticking clock came from. That's 3 phases and 11 steps. And the 3 first phases, first is around future thinking, making sure that our vision is appropriate for the digital era. The second is around centricity and mobilizing culture, customer, and operations and our employees around where we're moving towards and what we have to have in place. And then future ready, which is about what are our measures of digital value? How do we know we're going in the right direction to prescribe that future that you're talking about? So for us, in terms of the way that I would look at this, it's moving from independency into interdependency. That's what we need to do. We need to create ecosystems out of just different systems that have been legacy in place. And to me, Nigel, this is 20th century thinking versus 21st century thinking. There's many organizations who have that legacy who are having to transform based on years and years of working in the last century where processes and systems were developed. To reimagine that is such a big job, but it is absolutely needed. You can't just repurpose what you have in these different elements because it'll just be the same and create more tension. This is where we now can start thinking much more digitally, or digital era, if you like, the industry 4.0 era. So that's what we need to do. And at the heart of that goes back to something that we said before. It's actually the culture shift in the organization. It starts with mindset first, mindset at leadership level, that we need to change things. And where you see organizations that have changed beautifully, you see that this has started from the very top. So I think of, in Southeast Asia, for example, DBS Bank as the brilliant example of that. The most enlightened CEO that I know around this transformational period, Mr. Piyush Gupta, who really drove this to new levels in the organization, and then drove a culture appropriate for the digital era and put measurements in place that enabled them not just to measure the value of what they were doing, but some of the new things that they could now do now that they were adopting digital that they'd not even thought about before. So very interesting. So this movement from doing things differently into a more collective ecosystem, digitally enabled but fueled by the human touch, is what's making the difference between success and failure.
Jeremy, you mentioned DBS as an example of digital transformation done the right way. We also know of organizations that have blossomed in recent years, companies like Uber and Airbnb that have done very well in terms of digital transformation. But what would you say to new organizations, or perhaps existing ones that are facing difficulties in terms of the process? How do they ensure that they can achieve similar aspirations, but also maintain the core values that they currently have?
That's a really good question. And DBS Bank, I will use a quote from Piyush Gupta at DBS Bank, which I love, which is, the first thing not to do is just apply digital lipstick, which is making it look like we're doing all these things, talking a big story about all of these new systems and technologies that we're having in place, but then having no idea what that means and no idea how to implement it. So really, the heart of your question goes back to, how do you bring the people along with you, and how do you implement it as the way that we work now moving forward? So possibly in a similar industry, Ping An banking and insurance in China really saw this and really moved from what was a very, very traditional setup in terms of how they handled their customers from a banking perspective, but more so insurance, whereby if somebody had an accident on the road, for example, they would be waiting for days for an answer, weeks for a result of their inquiry. They've now brought that down to 6 minutes by embracing technology, redefining their culture, transcending, if you like, the more geopolitical evolution of China as a country, and embrace the more entrepreneurial way of working and a more collective way of working. They identified two key things which helped them in terms of their transformation, which was beyond what I've been talking about here, beyond the people, the culture, and all of these. The two other things that helped were speed, because what they realized was that speed really trumped size these days. You're no longer too big to fail. We're seeing the failure rates increasing. So it's those companies of whatever size that have the highest speed can actually change things rapidly. So the new organizations or the newer organizations that have existed just over 10 years that you mentioned, like Uber, Airbnb, reimagined a traditional industry far quicker than their incumbent colleagues, and were able to bring something to market which really changed the game. And the other thing that therefore Ping An found was this word perfection. Said, we need to be fast, but we don't need to be perfect, because a 70% solution can finish us. If somebody launches a 70% solution as version 1, then they have competitive advantage. We need to be quick. We need to get something out there, be prepared to fail early, fail fast, learn from it, and redevelop it. So lack of perfection is what's sort of almost changing the mentality around. And then understand link what we're doing internally with customers. So go beyond customer experiences into customer journeys. How do we track our customers' relationship with us from the moment that either they think of us, open an app, have a need for our services, through to when they've had it and then are thinking of either staying with us or changing? P&G and Levi's, for example, as two other more traditional businesses, are going into many of their core customers and are looking at every part of their business, even the parts that they don't yet interact with, to see how that they can become more efficient in how they work with them. So lots is being accelerated. And I would go back to what you said first. It's many of these innovative companies that we've seen rise in the last 10 years plus, which have really caused a rethink of what is possible. And that can only be a good thing, Nigel.
So Jeremy, in terms of digital transformation, and we see advancement in the technologies on a daily basis, moving into things like machine learning and artificial intelligence. What are your thoughts on this merging of the organic and the artificial?
Well, as I mentioned, I believe that in the digital era, the human touch is more important than it ever was. And we're experiencing that right now in the flood of remote working, how we can interact with people better, maybe bringing in much more, interestingly, more of the human skills than we've seen even when we were managing traditionally. There is much more talk about, as you mentioned before, wellness, mental health, empathy, a more collective approach to how we manage business, and a greater understanding that we can really unleash the power of our people. I call it unleashing the inner CEO. We've got the opportunity to have a more collective approach to leadership, not just burden our executive leaders with the challenges of what does a future strategy look like in an increasingly digital world, but also how do we unleash the power of our human capital within our organizations so that they can not only contribute in job role, but actually start to look at some of these issues, challenges, opportunities themselves. At the same time, how do we enable that with digital? So the rise of AI and robotics is in its very early stages right now, because the technology and bandwidth that we have is not really releasing the power within. But that will come with technologies like 5G, the microcomb, for example, which is a chip that is touting a power that could, for example, download 1,000 movies in 1 second. Then there is quantum computing, which takes it beyond again and gives you limitless bandwidth and possibility. But let's just go back to 5G. 5G is enabling technology is 10 times faster than 4G. So, faster than your fiber broadband right now. So the power in our pocket with our smartphones, the AIs in there, we're using them in very kind of low level ways at the moment, but with greater bandwidth and technology, we can really unleash them. Did a survey with Generation Z, which are the generation just coming into the workplace right now. 63% of them said that they expect to have a personal AI to work with when they join the workforce to help them with admin tasks, reporting, finding data, and so on. And I can see that happening. So it's the technology. Once we can unleash the technology, the appropriate technology, unlock the power of the AI in our pocket with greater bandwidth, that's where we can start to use the personal assistants and say, I'm not going to say it now because my phone will ping, but hey, I can say, hey Siri, because I've got an Android phone. So, or Siri, find me the data on this. And it's linked to the ecosystem that we talked about before, this ecosystem that is in place, which is now not defined by the different functions, but actually links and glues together the whole organization. So as long as those technologies can still enable the human touch, the human power, and the way that we do business, whether it's internal collaboration or externally with our customers, we're fine. As soon as we start to overwhelm it, that is where we're going to experience failure. And that is why largely many organizations are failing at the moment. They're going for the fad and the fashion in technology terms and suddenly realize it's not really appropriate for their business and don't know how to use it, or just use a fraction of it. So it's got to be fit for purpose, it's got to do the job, and it's got to link all of the organization together so that we remove our reliance, if you like, from the traditional APIs, etc. That we have to do a lot of work in the background to make things talk together.
That's fantastic. And I think, if I may rightly summarize, digital transformation should be empowering the human capital more so than replacing it.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that, and that is because, as I said before, digital transformation is an outmoded term. It is whole business model transformation, and by very definition, that means the digital, the human, the culture, the customer, everything.
Thank you, Jeremy. And we have heard you. We, we have heard about the ticking clock model. We have heard about gig HR and a few of your other endeavors. I think at this point we will wrap up the interview by asking, what are the key takeaway messages that you can offer to our audience members in terms of actionable strategies that they can implement and get their hands dirty on within the coming days. And also for yourself and your organization, where do you see yourself innovating? Where do you see yourself changing mindsets within the next 12 months?
Right. Well, actually, mindsets is what I want to talk about first of all. Before you can get to action, mindset has to be right. At leadership level, it has to be ready and willing to move forward into full-scale transformation and a reimagining of what the possibilities are. So not really trying to replicate what was and what we used to do, but focusing on what could be. And we have no better opportunity than now. We've been forced into a period of new working, being digitally transformed, unleashing the power of remote work. And many organizations are finding huge benefits and are starting to already think about how we can do things differently. Even traditional face-to-face organizations like McKinsey or PwC consultants, how they engage more remotely, how they move themselves away from offices. Twitter have come out just recently saying no employee needs to work in an office ever. You now have a choice. Spotify, Google, Facebook have all come out saying we're not going to go back to the office at least till 2021. This is the way we're going to do things around here. So in terms of getting to action, actually, it goes back to what I was saying before. We need the new rules. We need the new tools. We need to skill in different ways for new skills and behaviors for remote working or different ways of working. And we need to find ways to look after our people, celebrate when they get things right and when we make progress, look after the mindset and mental health while we're remotely and not together, because we are, of course, collective social creatures. We need that. So find creative things of doing it. And then the second piece that sort of links into that really is about ownership. It's repurposed management behind this growth mindset that I talked about, more coaching led, unleashing the power of our people so that our people can start to own much more than their job role and start contributing a little bit more. So as long as those foundation stones are in place in terms of the rules and the right tools, we're already able to move ahead. And then as we're doing that, a more collaborative and collective approach to how we're doing it will help. So a lot of peer coaching could be a great way of doing things here. Having Zoom sessions like this, whereby we don't just get into the business agenda, but we actually have some social time to talk about what's working, how we're feeling, fun, TV, whatever it is, we have to start to do that more. And that is a message for leaders and managers. They have to be more empathetic in terms of their leadership style. So the second half of your question to me was, how am I going to keep changing mindsets? Well, I'm working on a book right now, which really links to what I've just said, which is called Unleash the Inner CEO. For me, this is the age of empowerment. We have the best opportunity ever to use the power of our people and realize when I was in organizations, we used to call it leadership at all levels within the organization, or leadership at any level. That for me is absolutely key. Again, when I went out and researched, there are plenty of books on leadership, plenty of books on soft skills and communication skills, but no book or no textbook, manual, method for leaders at any level to unleash that power. So contribute at job role, start to display leadership, management, collaborative skills. So that's what I'm working on. And in fact, I've just finished the first draft of that book. So I'm hoping to release it at the end of this year. But boy, wow, it's hard work, let me tell you. So I'm keeping challenging the norm, and this new way of leadership, this new way of a new collective way of leadership, I believe is coming of age, and which is why I feel that this book will be really important. And then, because I've done research on leadership and management readiness, digital transformation, the blended workforce, within my business, one of the biggest demands I'm getting at the moment is for a rush to how do we sell more effectively our goods, services, products, solutions in the remote world, and using digital tools and embracing the digital sphere to be more networked and connected and go beyond, again, a sales job role into actually more talking at more industry level. So elevating what we do. So my new piece of research towards the end of this year with another partner of mine, Anne Boissier-Fouché, will be how sales is evolving. So the state of, if you like, selling evolution, how organizations are mastering the virtual sell, and what organizations are failing and what are the consequences. So the benefits, the consequences of this. That's the new piece of research. So the book and that research is how I'm going to keep banging the drum for whole business transformation, Nigel.
That sounds amazing, Jeremy. And we look forward to reading your book at some point later this year. And of course, to our audience members, we'll definitely keep them updated in terms of your book and also your endeavors through the newsletters. But in the meantime, the white papers that you've released based on the research that you've done, and also just in general the great achievements that you have been able to do in terms of assisting organizations. All this can be found in some of the links which we will place below this video.
Mindset is so key on this. One of the reasons why I left my previous organization is that I felt the mindset of the organization was stuck in the past. We started talking a good game around transformation and how we did things, but actually looking fundamentally at some of the big shifts that were out there and how our organization and office needs to change really didn't link with my own view of it. I was the only one in the organization doing pieces of research like this. So I felt that ultimately that meant that I was going to make the move out and do this myself and contribute to businesses in a different way. So for organizations who are going through this now, it's really up to the leadership and management to role model this, because one thing that you don't want to do is lose your best people through this period. So if you're bringing them along with the journey, if you're open enough to say, I don't have all the answers, I need to learn, I possibly need to learn from you in our organization in terms of a bit of reverse mentoring. We should do all this together, but let's start thinking how we reimagine our business. Then that more human style of leadership, more greater empathy starts to link all of the different human components together, regardless of the level, and really starts to help everybody look at the challenges and opportunities collectively and move forward as one, and engage in the organization for the longer term, not just for the short-term journey.
So that's great, Jeremy. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your contributions. I'm sure the audience members have found this tremendously enlightening. And of course, if you have any questions, any comments, please send them through the various channels that we have available, and we will get Jeremy to address some of them, and his feedback will be published in our regular email newsletters subsequent to this conference. So once again, thank you, Jeremy, for your time.
And thank you, Nigel, for having me. I really enjoyed the session. And thank you to everyone for listening.